Right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar where we're going to be talking about the value of nature-inspired innovation in the UK. We are currently recording this webinar in York itself, not anywhere we've been kidnapped. We can prove that we're actually doing well. So we're just going to run through some of the research we've been carrying out for the past, 15, 18 months?
Yes.
Yeah, and then please ask any questions. Do post in where you're from. And any questions, do use the Q&A session, which you can find at the bottom of the Zoom webinar, and that'd be great.
And just as a note, we'll be happy to share the presentation with everyone present in the next couple of days at best, Richard.
Yep.
We just want to make sure that we correct any grammar or edits and last final minute things, and then we'll shoot it off to everyone. So bear with us for a couple of days and we'll get you the presentation as well.
Great, thank you. So let's kick off and then we can pick up your questions as you go along. Any questions, just ask them. We will answer them at the end. So one of the people that's kind of had a quite an impact on our work and the way of doing things is Professor Julian Vincent, who's now a honorary professor at Heriot-Watt University. And one of the quotes that when we've been talking is actually what we look at. And we shouldn't, a bit like if anyone's a designer, don't get fixated and falling in love with the prototype. And the same thing in nature-inspired innovation. Do not just fixate yourself with the biology, because you can get sucked into going down dead ends. So this is very much the basis of our project moving forward. So here we are. So there's myself, Richard. I founded Biomimicry Innovation Lab on 2019 on Christmas Day, thinking, yeah, 2020 is going to be a great year. Well, slightly challenging things ahead, but and on my right, your left is Yuning. Recently joined the company from a graduate in engineering, design, innovation. Is that right?
Innovation design.
Three words, put them in an order. From the Royal College of Art and Imperial College. And then my other side is Shuram Nadathar, who's now based in the UK and is an entrepreneur, investor, and philanthropist, and actually the co-head of the Nadathar Group. And we've got a lot of the family from the Nadathar family office joining us today as well. So hello, everyone. So one of our key areas of looking into this is actually not just innovation and technological solutions, because we're seeing a lot of that by, if anyone's read the UK net zero strategies and government's talking about, how are we actually pushing the agenda for, solving situations for a better world. And it really needs to be thinking of this kind of as a bigger kind of network development to actually tying them together. So instead of saying I'm solving zero hunger or good health and well-being, considering the fact if you break it all the way down to what is the sustainable development, if anyone's read Our Common Goods, is it Our Common Good, the report by the Brundtland report, it's very much talking about how you actually need to consider the social work aspects of, improving people's lives, and then looking into nature as well. So you're talking about connecting into the biosphere, the social aspects, and then economic aspects is bringing together as well. So our big area of our projects looking into, what is the environmental and various aspects of technical solutions for sustainable innovation that actually our UK academics are doing. So why are we looking to nature-inspired innovation? And we'll get on to why we're calling it nature-inspired innovation instead of biomimicry or biomimetics. And it's really looking at new ways to do things, looking at using less materials, resources, and actually doing things that are actually then feeding back into this kind of low entropy system, tending towards a circular economy. It's doing things with, more, faster, cheaper, stronger. Companies are doing this around the world. It's really about tapping into this massive research base that we've actually got, not just looking to biology, but actually what we're looking at by coming out of UK scientific research. So by doing some research into using Semantic Scholar and Google Trends, we've noticed in the past 10 years or 11 years, and actually 171% increase in patents, almost as similar in publications, and massive spike in news articles as well. And if any of you are interested in our full report, we'll be talking a bit more about how the OECD is looking actually, it's a growth in economic output from a country by actually increasing patents. So where we're clearly looking at actually companies, it's not all just creating chocolate teapots. There are actually useful pieces of research out there. Now, for those of you who are not familiar, you've got biology to design or design to biology methodologies for looking to abstracting, good ideas. We're breaking this down into, commonly called research orientated or industry orientated and research orientated. It's very much about studying in depth one aspect of biology. It could be looking into naked mole rats, spider silk, fracture mechanics, looking into mother of pearl, and then finding a way to translate that across into a technical solution. And research actually done by a team led by Shoshana Jacobs at Guelph, University of Guelph, and Michael Helms at Georgia Tech. And they've actually been looking at building up their database, and they've found the majority of research and solutions are actually taken from this research-oriented approach. Now, on the flip side, by looking at the other way round, you've actually got industry-oriented. So you're saying you've got a problem. First of all, you should go to a doctor about that. But anyway, you should actually, what technical solution problem we've got, can we break this down? And is there a biological strategy or strategies that we can actually take from the natural world and actually solve our problems? So let's start off by looking into our academic insights.
Yeah, I think one of the things that our research tried to do was really figure out what's the scope of nature-inspired research across UK. Is it widespread? Are there many academic institutions doing it? Are there dedicated research labs doing it? Or is it individual academics? And I think part of it was just trying to understand how wide, how deep, and how prolific across sectors was nature-inspired research.
Yeah, I mean, when we started this research, we didn't expect to find as much as we did. And we had a number of keywords and phrases, which we'll get onto in a second. And we found over 1,500 academics or researchers in the UK. The reason why we're starting off with researchers is all the way from master's level up to professors who are still active in the research space. And we feel that this number is actually too low, because a lot of universities, and some of you, on this webinar today probably notice that master students and some of your PhDs are not on university websites. You would have to then go around and start finding where they're tied in. And that could actually open up and say that we, there is a massive growth of this people doing research in the UK.
Yeah, I also think that another reason why this might be an underestimate is that many people may not call themselves nature inspired. Yeah. They might have gotten inspiration from something that they saw, but they looked at it from a matter of principle or from a matter of a particular solution. They're not necessarily calling it nature inspired. So there may be things, for example, easy example would be biotech. Nobody calls biotech nature inspired, but effectively it's leveraging or learning from nature and applying it, whether you're dealing with proteins or antibodies or anything else. So it's also an underestimate to some extent, because people may not be calling themselves in that, using this nomenclature.
Yeah, and we found that as well when we were speaking to various academics, especially in the medical field, of looking into nanomedicine and thinking into areas such as, looking at COVID vaccines and other areas which actually the UK is one that is going to excel at in the next, coming decades. So from all this research, we ended up interviewing 200 plus researchers and industry professionals, and we found from all this that there's actually over 100, is actually tending towards 125 research labs. Now, that's not saying they're just doing nature-inspired innovation. That's some of them, like I was mentioning, medical fields or new materials or different engineering sciences that actually are using this as part of their kind of design R&D development process. And this is just expanding a bit on more of this. And when we send this across, it gives you some understanding. We're working with some companies in Singapore to actually understand the information as well, to start building out what are actually people meaning about, what are the challenges that people are looking for when they're actually doing the research and trying to get into commercialization. And Yuning is actually going to be picking up on that in a minute. So the reason why we're kind of summarizing it and calling it nature-inspired innovation, we're not trying to put a badge in it. It's quite hard not to. We looked at all these different phrases from biomimicry, biomimetics, by-inspired with hyphen, by inspiration. You can get the gist. And we found that a lot of people, most people use various phrases depending on where they're actually putting it in their research papers. And it's got to the point now that people don't care about the word. We shouldn't care about that. We're talking about solution focused. Do we actually start looking at pushing this forward and actually getting things out into the space instead of having an argument about, who uses which word, how, when, and where, because, that ends up just being a bit like silly politics at times, and that's not actually providing solutions.
Yeah, so I think what we decided was pick a terminology or a word like nature-inspired innovation, hopefully to encompass all these different definitions that people have and all these different ways people look at inspiration. And we didn't want to pick one term. So we just came up and said, look, everything is based on nature. So let's call it nature-inspired innovation and put everything under that umbrella. And yes, there might be differences in opinions on definitions and what's what, but that's not our intent. Our intent is to figure out how do we translate information and knowledge from nature into something that solves human problems.
Yeah, it's all about how do we create a healthy ecosystem for innovation to happen.
Correct.
So this is one of our pieces of research. We're looking at, the geographic spread, and yeah, London and the Southeast has got, the biggest population in the UK. So therefore they're tied into some of the more active research universities. But it's interesting to see that there is a spread around the entire of the UK as well. And please note, anyone from Northern Ireland, we do apologise, but that just has been missed off the map. And there are a number of the larger universities in Belfast doing actually some brilliant research, and I feel bad about missing it out because one of my mentors from my master's program actually is based in Belfast. So Greg, if you're watching, I do apologise. But yeah, breaking it down regional areas, London, it's got the most amount of different variety of universities, Imperial College, London School of Economics, Central St Martin's, and you're seeing that tied into the classic red brick or Russell Group universities as well.
Yeah, and I think the key takeaway from this is, while it is true you'd expect a large proportion of the research to happen in the universities that you're familiar with, whether it's in London, Oxford, or Cambridge, what you also notice is, I think, if I'm not mistaken, about 36 to 40% of the research is actually happening outside of this group of academic institutions. So Richard, talk about these different ways these people are doing it.
Yeah, so some of the universities in the Russell Group and are part of the N8 research as well as part of the Scottish Research Partnership, before I get told off by any of the senior academics on this call. But we're looking at, other universities are pushing it. And from our conversations with UKRI, actually, it's about promoting research across the country and not just having it all centered around these traditional, heavy research centers. And you never know, because they're more likely to have favorable terms for actually tech transfer into academic, industry, solutions, and actually be more favorable with their intellectual property, which we'll cover a little bit in a second. We broke it down into larger subjects, starting off with engineering, although that's vast. Medicine, computer science, chemistry, biology, and then we had some of the other subjects which didn't come up as much, but we felt it was important to actually continue doing those research. And again, for some of you who filled in our survey, we asked you to give me a second, Mark, and I'll just come back to you in a second. We asked them, which area does some of their work fall into? Is it just engineering, or is it computer science and biology and environment? And we found that people, again, a bit like the keywords, it sits across in a number of
different disciplines.
Yeah, different disciplines. And sorry, Mark, if you've had a question, do you want us to answer it right at the end?
Richard, why don't we continue with this, and we'll come back to the questions so that we go with the flow of it and come back to the questions at the end. That's fine.
So we started breaking it down into engineering. Is the main subject, and yeah, there's Mark raising his hand, and there's a quote by Mark. We found it's breaking it down into various areas, and these are again top 5. We found a long list of these, and it felt it wasn't right, but to break it down ever. But the key one for this is actually the materials science, and yeah, some of the areas that started coming out a bit, like Sharon was talking about bioengineering, biotechnology, and pulling these out as well. And you start going down by other areas, and again, into medicine was the second highest, biomedical engineering, crossing over domains from engineering as well. And again, into computer science, which also covers things like robotics and AI algorithms and this computation, again with the robotics crossing over a number of disciplines. And again, in chemistry was the third highest. And we found, again, material science is very, very strong in this, which again is a very, very high area with across multi-discipline and multi-domain science. We'll just skip through these biology and the rest of them because they didn't call up as many solutions into things like physics, which great quotes here, but when you get the report actually from the photonics lab at University of Cambridge, but again, the physics area, important one there calling out biophysics and material science. And into mathematics as well, into mathematical biology and modeling, which again is crossing onto computer science. So we weren't just looking at domains that were sitting on their isolation. Where is it building up clusters of research, whether it's in research labs or research that needs this collaboration across domains? Design did not have a lot of researchers in the UK. That could be partly because it's master's and PhD level, but from our conversations with a number of leading research labs around the world, what they found is actually you need the designers to take the scientific research and build it into something usable, pretty, because how many engineers could make a beautiful water bottle like that? I'm not dissing engineers.
Not just pretty.
Functional as well, yeah. Again, it's our architecture. Sustainable architecture is very, very high one there in materials science. And we'll skip through environment and social science, but what?
Yeah, I think one of the key things is when you notice material science appears across all of this, what it means is distinctly within each, whether it's physics or whether it's architecture or whether it is engineering, material science, these are non-mutual, which means these are things that are happening within those disciplines. And yet you see that there is an overlap of the field of material science across all of this stuff. So I think the key message from this is there is a huge breadth of research, no matter what sector you're in, no matter what field you're in, there seems to be a lot of research going on, especially in nature-inspired innovation. And there are some commonalities that you see, and there are some things that seem to be more prevalent than others, but there is a huge breadth across disciplines. And I think that's the key point, and that's encouraging. That we would have assumed that you'd find a much narrower slice where things would be concentrated and where nature-inspired innovation might be more available, but looks like there is a huge breadth of it. And I think that's good news for people in the field.
Yeah,
definitely.
So hopefully, Mark, that answers your question. We also started not just asking the academics, do you want to, what are you doing? Actually, do they want to commercialize? And majority do, but in different ways. Depending on the level of seniority at a university, they're more likely to not, because the risk of leaving their job and working for a startup, and considering the fact that the majority of companies fail very early on. But this was actually a lot higher when you actually start looking at researchers actually at more junior level, from master's level up to postdoc, where about a third of them were actually willing to leave their research completely, maybe at the other end of master's or PhD, and going and starting working in a company.
Yeah, and what we found was that, as you would expect, for people in academia who might be tenured or who might have a long-standing interest in remaining in academia, their interest is in figuring out how do I commercialize my research, but not necessarily leave academia. And so they are interested in figuring out models that work where they can transfer the technology or where they can be co-founders in a startup, but they really want to do it on a more part-time basis, right? And what you see is that people who are in postdoc who don't yet have maybe a tenure or who are still early in their career and are willing to consider careers in academia and industry, there is a greater desire to be in the startup and do it on a full-time basis. So I think it's a mix. And I'm caricaturing it to make a point, but this is the general caricature, but we see that there is significant interest, whether it's in licensing or whether it's in starting up a new company. And there is that interest. I guess we'll come down to the reasons and challenges for it as we evaluate, and as Yuning will discuss soon.
Great, thank you. And Mark, don't apologize for raising your hand. I know what you're like with technology, so yeah. Right, moving on to Yuning, who's going to be covering industrial insights.
So, hi everyone. After looking into the role of nature-inspired innovation in the academic landscape, We started to look at how people have been bringing the concept and discoveries in the lab into the real world application in the industry. We first look at the background factors that influence the innovation ecosystem in the UK, especially governmental innovation strategies. The UK government has laid this future plan in the 2021 policy paper, UK Innovation Strategy for the Development of Private Sector Innovation by making the most of the UK research development and innovation system. Through Prime Minister's agenda, they are placing science, innovation, and technology at the heart of this vision for the UK to be a science superpower in 2030. This will be achieved through 4 pillars: unleashing business, attracting innovation talents, strengthening institutional resources, and facilitating innovations to solve grand challenges. On the other hand, with ambitious environmental goals targeted by UK government, slashing emissions by 75% by 2035, as well as the latest net zero came out 3 days ago, we can feel that both the strong currents in the UK ecosystem steering towards technological breakthroughs as well as sustainable innovations, which makes UK an exciting environment for innovation relating to cutting edge technologies and sustainability. This also resonates with the focus of nature-inspired innovation. According to our surveys targeted to industry participants at Nature-Inspired Innovation, nearly half of them are focusing on environmental-related fields, whereas the second biggest cluster is looking at technological focus innovation. So we've done some keyword search based on the R&D and sustainability research web pages of the top 10 FTSE 100 companies, as well as the environmental targets from governmental reports and NGOs. And we plot them into our academic research database to index the mapping overlapping frequency between keywords. And here's the result. Although the search is not exhaustive, it does show a strong linkage between academic research and industry needs, especially in the following fields, such as manufacturing, materials, AI and neuroscience, medicine. For example, in our database, we've seen research spin out working on precision biomanufacturing, inspired by DNA scaffolding that aims to replace petrochemical manufacturing, animal intelligence mimicking robotics, and precision brain surgery tools inspired by an ovipositing wasp. However, opportunities always comes with challenges. Based on our research, we identified several main barriers that hinders the development of nature-inspired innovation, among which always financial factors remain the biggest challenge, accounting for more than a third of the proportion, along with external markets and skills and time being significant potential hindrance. One of our insights is that a good partnership between academia and industry can be the key to solve many challenges in terms of attracting fundings, facilitates and generate groundbreaking and innovation. Yet based on our research, a lot of times we find out that there are challenges in forming a commercially viable partnership. First of all, is that most of the research levels are remain at a very early stage, which many of the industry partners are not willing to take part because they think that it's too far from application. Secondly, it also takes a lot of resources and time to complete the R&D process from an early stage to a commercial viable stages. And also, thirdly, it's very difficult to get alignments across among its researchers and institutions, especially on the commercial terms for sharing intellectual properties and patents. But there needs to have more partnership to translate the findings and ingenuity of nature into real world solutions. Based on our insight, we suggest that early engagement from different stakeholders can really facilitate the R&D process and direct the R&D process towards a more solution-oriented direction.
Yeah, and I think what you said is right, Yuning. There's a huge amount of, I think expectation setting has been a big problem.
Yes.
Once people reach TRL level 4, there seems to be a view that, this is something that is close enough to the market, or if not close enough to the market, it's advanced a lot. I don't think industry necessarily thinks it's advanced a lot. Industry still thinks it's kind of at the beginning of doing something. So I think there's a mismatch in how TRL levels might be viewed and how much time and effort it takes. And I think so that's one set of problems, right?
Yes,
there's a
definitely.
mismatch between what the industry thinks and what academia thinks. I think the second set would be in terms of industry can't wait for 3 to 4 years in most cases.
Yes.
They don't have the internal organizational structure to wait 3 to 4 years in collaboration with academia. There are exceptions, of course, but majority of them neither have the people, the organization, or the resources to be able to do that. So it seems to them that it's too early, and so they give up and they don't even try too much. I mean, but what we have seen that has been successful, like you said, is when there is early collaboration.
Yes.
And when there is more of the market getting into the lab, there's a greater chance of success of that product actually reaching the market. There's better expectation matching between industry and academia, and those work. And I think that's kind of the message we're getting here, that needs to be an expectation setting both on the part of academia and industry. There needs to be collaboration with the understanding that it's a process and not an end. And I think that's a challenge that needs to be overcome.
Yeah, it's all about how do we establish a common language, a common coordinate, so that they can all work together towards the same goal.
Yeah.
I mean, going right the way back to the quote right at the beginning, it's about as well understanding that you don't need to, if the biology ends up you improving on what's, the functions, mechanisms, but at the end of the day, you're about creating a better solution. It's a 10 times better solution, whether it's environmental, for the medical industry, these kind of things. So focusing on the solution aspect and not, it has to be this nature inspired that.
Yeah, that's also where there needs to be more of the input from market into the lab so that research and academia have better information and better way to set the direction of how development happens and what direction does the R&D take for it to be of commercial value. And I think that's something, the more tighter the collaboration, I think the better information is exchanged between academia and industry.
Yeah. So we moved on to funding landscape. Sorry.
So this gets us to funding and what are the sources of funding. Just to start off with, I think if you look at this chart and if you look at the following couple of charts, one of the things we realize is there's a lot more money, irrespective of whether it comes from grants or whether it comes from VCs, angels, industry. There's a lot more money going into sustainability, clean tech. So this chart is on sustainability. And as you can see, there's a huge increase over the last 4 or 5 years, which means there's now money available in one way, shape, or form, even if it's difficult to find, even if it's difficult to match to academic projects, there is money going. Similarly, if you look at sustainable investments, now whether you look at private equity, venture capital, again, there seems to be a lot more money available. And hence, it seems that there are opportunities for people to tap into this increased interest in terms of investors and funding. And here are examples of where money has been going into what we call emerging space, or rather what PitchBook calls emerging spaces, right? Mm-hmm. So everything from electric vehicles, sharing infrastructure, quantum computing. Now you might look at it and say, how is this related to biomimicry or nature inspired? Mm-hmm. The point we are making is we're taking a broader view of nature inspired.
Yes.
Right. And so when you look at assistive technologies, these may not be necessarily things that you would consider to be, biomimetic, but these are taking inspiration from how do we help carry higher burdens or higher loads? How do we deal with exoskeletons? And these do take inspiration, if not explicitly, at least implicitly. And these are all related to how you create a more circular economy or sustainable economy. So in that sense, we're including all of this just to show you there is money available and money is available in these areas. I think it's also a question of how do we match ourselves to these areas where funding is available so we can access these monies. Typically what we have found, again, when we did our surveys and our interviews, is that while there seems to be funding available for the initial stages, once we cross technology readiness level 4, which means we have proof of concept in the lab. After that, there seems to be a dearth of funding available. Now, there may be multiple reasons for why there's a dearth of funds. It may be the case that grant agencies are less inclined to give monies at this stage, Richard. I think one of the finding was that there's a paucity of funds available once you've crossed a certain TRL level.
Yeah, it's into Innovate UK, but it's also at certain levels as where do you fit? If you're looking at biology but then engineering, do you then align with one funding UKRI funding agent or another? And you can end up slipping through the barriers and getting confused, as well as some of the academics saying, because this can be a lot more risky, you're then finding as well that some of the universities are not even promoting it forward because they've got multiple different, different professors in a research lab actually wanting to commercialize as well. So they're going for the lower hanging fruit. And the tricky thing is here, if you've got the UK government wanting to promote certain areas, say net zero innovation strategy, then UKRI, is that then filtered down to the universities? And then what if the startups or researchers then want to commercialize at a high level? You're going back up too many steps to actually get things to the market.
So I think the challenge of fitting your project to how a grant agency defines who can access funding, I think has been a big challenge, especially because nature-inspired innovation tends to cross boundaries, and inherently the research requires involvement of multiple boundaries. So I think that has been one challenge. I think one more of the challenges we found was that when funding was available, I think what we commonly heard in our interviews was the quantum of money wasn't sufficient necessarily to move from one TRL to another. So what would happen is you'd get some amount of funding and you'd make some progress, but you wouldn't have moved necessarily to the next TRL level, which means then it becomes difficult to justify the next round of grant that you want to raise. And so I think the quantum of money available was one challenge that people brought up, and also how long the duration of the funding was another challenge. Inevitably, it's difficult for a new postdoc to come in or an existing postdoc to finish a project in 6 months and deliver results. So I think there was a concern that there's a quantum of money problem, but also the expectation of results within a very short duration. In fact, what we commonly heard was, look, if you manage and give us X amount of money for Y period, we can definitely show you results. But because we are forced to fit into these shorter duration, shorter quantum, it's very difficult for us to either get postdocs or fund postdocs and get movement from one TRL level to another. And I think that's been an area where, again, you have challenge in getting access to funding. So I think these typically tend to be what we have seen as big challenges. Now, on one hand, we see that there is money being put, whether it's government agencies or whether it's the UK government's industrial strategy or climate strategy, whether it is investors, VCs, there seems to be money going in. But I think the way people are looking at it is different. And I think there needs to be some way where I think at a policy level, we need to be able to have conversations with governments and grant agencies, including private grant agencies, people like Wellcome Trust or others, to talk about how the more complex systems require interdisciplinary work, which means grants have to be redefined or re-looked at in terms of accessibility so that these kinds of complex things that need to work can actually receive grants. And similarly, in terms of how do we make sure that if you're actually going to give money to somebody, how productive is that money if it's not allowing the researcher to move from one TRL level to another? So I think these are things where we need to influence policymakers and decision makers on that side of things. On the other side of things, I think we need to really look at academic research and say, how do we make sure that we have access to industry, access to angels and venture investors who can give us a better sense of whether my technology or my product or my innovation has large commercial application or does it have a very small commercial application? And how do I then fine tune it? How do I also fine tune my pitch so that I can apply to the sources of funding which exist? Yes, it may be difficult, but again, it's trying to create this balance. So I think all sides of the equation need to figure this out. And I think if you look at the last 4 to 5 years, there has been a huge focus on deep tech and deep science, where people are realizing that, this is not just about software. These things take 5 to 8 years to develop, and people are willing to look at it more recently in the last 4 to 5 years. So how do I find those people? How do I access them? And what we, for example, have found is, I think what Richard, we've collected about 400 sources of funding just in the UK alone.
Yeah, and that comes in from philanthropy, research councils, industry, and then universities where they're directing the money in as well. And
you're not even including traditional VCs who might be looking at, right?
That's completely separate. I mean, in our previous drafts, I must admit, the 1 year in both of them does look a lot higher, but that is because Tesla screwed up the data because there's one outlier of 70 billion in each one. So
I think there's funding available. I think there's opportunities for it, but I also think that we need to change the way both academics look at it, investors look at it, and government agencies look at it, because ultimately all of us are trying to figure out how do we take innovation and deliver solutions that are sustainable, that help not just from a commercial perspective, but from an environmental and social perspective. And I think nature offers some of the best solutions. And I think it's worthwhile for us to take a look at it. So just to summarize at the end of it, if you look at a few takeaways from what we have come up with, the report is obviously much longer and we have a lot more data, but in the interest of time, we just wanted to get down to a few key takeaways from our perspective. I think there's been a big yearning across parties, whether it's industry or academia, is how do we create a better connected network so that whether I need to find people to brainstorm, whether I need to find people to collaborate across disciplines, whether I need to get market input on my project. So how do we create this kind of network? So call it something like a lunch club for nature-inspired research or something similar to that, where it's easy for you to access, but it doesn't come with too much formality. It's a bit more casual, but it still allows you to connect, access people that you need to access so that you can then figure out what to do. And I think this is an area that needs to be worked on. Second, I think one of the challenges has been the expectations that academics should become entrepreneurs, I think might be appropriate for some small percentage of academics, but for a large percentage, I think it's the science, it's the engineering, it's the academic area that's of interest. And the best way to deal with it is by finding them co-founders, by helping them understand what it means to be in a business, but not forcing them to be something that they're not.
Yes.
But by saying that, how do I augment your skills and your capabilities with some other skills, with complementary skills and capabilities, maybe a co-founder, maybe a team that then brings together the best of technical ability, business ability, and provides some level of workshop and training so you understand what it means to be in a business. So I think there are companies, there are people who are starting to do that, and there are accelerators like IndieBio in the US, and maybe small players like Will Be in the UK who are looking to do this stuff. And I think we need to do a lot more on that space. I think the closer partnership between academia and industry, I think that is something, I sense a greater need from the industry to fight for sustainability and improve processes, systems, products. And I think, again, how do we make this part of the network that we are trying to build so that the network is not just about an academic network, but people who are aligned come together to translate nature-inspired research into real-world solutions and real-world impact. And I think the fourth one was public policy. How do we influence public policy to allow for complex areas to receive grants? How do we make sure that those grants are sufficient and effective grants so that they have enough duration and time to allow for it? And it'd be nicer to have more funding available from private agencies, from anybody. And by the way, but that's always going to be the case. I don't think there's anybody who will say there's enough funding for things. No. Yeah, but there are funding available. Yes, there needs to be more funding. I think it's not just more funding. It's about how do we fine tune the funding? How do we make the funding more efficient? And there are successful models. I think one of the big challenges also has been in collaborating with academia is how do we take best practices of licensing? Should I be charging 50% equity in a company which spun out of my university? Should I be creating problems with IP? Should I be charging very high licensing fees? I think these are issues that need to be dealt with. And there are best practices and there are universities across the world who have done this really, really well. And I think we might need to take a page out of those books and look from those best practices and apply those to our individual universities or academic situations to see what fits best for us. And I think these are the kinds of things that we think are the next steps. And what I want to leave all of you with this, we don't necessarily have answers to how to do this. We're hoping that we are talking to you about these issues. We've come up with some research, and we're hoping that we could include you and ask you for help and figure out how do we as a community look at these and figure out how to help solve these problems so that we can move forward. On that, thank you very much. And we will now stop. And I think we have some questions, so we'll get to the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you. We'll just go down these in order and hopefully we can answer all of these in turn. So Ruben, on your question about tying in, I believe you were talking about tying in with the words biomimicry, bionics. We are aware that the slight differences, that's come out through your work and your PhD as well as in ISO standards. And we're not wanting to just label it. We're just like, well, it's about getting stuff done, not worrying about who's doing X and who's doing Y. And that feeding into Jared's message, the key thing here, and it's something that you and I are looking at, how do we do a fuzzy search for words? some of the work, the research we did in searching for biomimicry and all the related terms, the platform we're using allowed us to do it automatically. So it's pulling on all the different phrases. So it means having to either find a really good AI system, and the latest one it's called BERT, isn't it, by Google?
Yeah, last year Google released a new AI search tool.
So allowing you to then do a bigger mapping exercise, and we've done that as well and identified. It took me a bit of time, but there's about 8,500 people around the world doing different areas, but that's not even including biomanufacturing. Do you mind? Shall I just? I'm on a roll here.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, Christian, and the common language. Yeah, that is really, really tricky at getting understanding the need and what you're just talking about. Actually, what is success, and aligning these together. And even that, you're finding that. I'm sure some of you are biologists speaking to engineers. Is the common language there as well?
And I think when we talk about common language, ultimately, it's not about biology, physics, chemistry. It's about saying, here's the problem that I'm trying to solve, and being able to talk in the language of what's the problem you're trying to solve. Am I making a better alternative to thermocol packaging? Am I making a better fuel than what's available today, which is more carbon neutral? So I think it's about talking in terms of what, if you're selling to a consumer, what a layperson can understand. If you're selling to a business, can you talk to them in the language of their product, their specifications for their product? Similarly to a regulator. And I think that's what we need to have as a common language of real world impact.
Yeah, and some of you on here, especially Siddharth and Sheffield, that question on investments against TRL, yes, we've looked into that, and that was some through our surveys, as well as breaking it down. How long does it, and what's the time and capital needed to go from basic concept TRL1 to market and all the way up to TRL4 and above? And we've broken those down into what's the quickest, the shortest time, and which the longest time for in different topics as well.
Yeah, and I think what the question we had asked people was, how much funding do you need and how much time you need between each TRL levels?
Yeah.
And so we do have the data from what we have collected. In terms of where does the funding actually happen, I think it happens across multiple levels.
Yeah.
I think we have seen funding happen at TRL level 1. We have seen funding happen at TRL level 5. But what we did see, as you saw in the chart that we presented on funding, at least from our survey respondents, now this may be a smaller sample size, we found that after TRL4, the funding level actually decreases. Now, this does not take into account companies or startups that have already been spun off from a university, which might be then not part of this survey that we had done, because they'd be part of a startup, and that would be a different piece of the equation. So we see that there is a decrease in funding level, at least from an academic perspective, beyond TRL level 4, which is why we had talked about the fact that UK, BRI, or places like that may find it difficult to grant funding beyond a certain TRL levels. But unfortunately, we can't be very clear on the data, because there are enough startups which have gone ahead and either raised grant funding through sources available or individual funding. So in that sense, we don't have full answers to it.
Yeah, and Jared, and I'm not 100% sure, do you know SBIR, there is different, the funding there for individual research isn't as high. You just have to look around for it. So this is why, the latest innovation strategy from the UK is very much about pushing into private investment. So we're to build our active network, and this very much tags into, I believe, is that Jamie at Biomimicry Frontiers, if I'm guessing right. We're looking at not best building a company of a network of academics, of industry, of investors. Is about getting the right thing in, because we've get quite often approached by industry asking, how do you solve this problem? And we're like, well, it's good us coming up and helping that, but it could be 10 years to get into commercialization. Why don't we do this as a kind of open innovation and saying, right, here's a bunch of academics within the UK, or it might be a case of elsewhere, who are actually closer to market, meaning it can be then transferred very, very quickly into their potential solution.
Yeah, but honestly, look, we do not have the characteristics of what it means to have a better connected network. Because when we looked at the survey response and we looked at the data, there's multiple requirements from that network. It's not a single requirement that says, this is what I want. So I would say that I think different people want to connect for different reasons, but the common thread seems to be, can all the people who are interested in this space, whether you're interested in as an investor or as a researcher, can we all find a common place to connect so that irrespective of what we might need, we have a place to connect and we have a place to brainstorm and get help. I think that is the most common thing we can find. Beyond that, I think it's something we don't have an answer for. And I also don't think any answer we find today is likely to remain the answer tomorrow. This is something that needs to evolve and grow as the community grows, and it'll take its own shape and form. And so we are seeking ideas and inputs on how to create a self-growing community, which doesn't need a chaperone, but which grows on its own and builds on its own. And
self-assembly.
Yeah, self-assembly.
And let's go to Tukir, your questions about learning from it. In our report, we're going to have a number of references and suggested reading, but I don't mind if you've registered for the online through this event directly through Eventbrite. I really don't mind reaching out and giving you some examples. I'd recommend even reading Margot's book there, and Biomimicry in Business. And yes, one of the things, especially if you start looking into manufacturing, where does the place in the world sit? How do you protect the fragile habitats where the factories are, where you're getting materials from as well? So you're actually starting to look at building up this big model. You're finding that a lot of the work we've been looking at into food systems. So you're not just about protecting it where the factory's building. Say if you're from, a tea or coffee company, but actually can you then look at where everything's coming across the supply chain? Because it's about protecting the habitats, but also the people working in these countries as well.
But you're true, Margot. I don't think we pay enough attention to this. And I think sometimes it becomes very difficult when trying to coalesce 25, 30 different companies who might be in an area to deal with this. But yeah, it is a big issue that needs to be addressed. But this is not something that we particularly have looked at in our research.
Yeah, and Siddharth, yes, to answer your question, so Siddharth's question, key outcomes is better connect inventors with investors. Yes, that's what we are going to be doing, and that's what you could say we're doing already.
We're doing to some extent, but look, we can't do it by ourselves, honestly. The three of us sitting here are just not going to be able to do this by ourselves. What we need is really a self-organizing community. We might be a seed, we might be able to start something off, but we need the community to come together, and that includes people in business. So I think one would be, for example, why don't we mine open innovation platforms to look at what people have identified as problems? When we look at what the trends are and where businesses are looking to put money, why don't we look at what are the biggest issues CEOs are being asked to do by their boards? Why don't we look at where there is pressure on companies from shareholders? And I think we need to look at all of these stuff and figure out what do those tell us. I don't think we're going to have a direct one-on-one answer, but if you could create a community and if you could use that community, ask these questions and more, maybe there'll be a better connect between inventors, problem owners, and investors.
Well, the point on Margot's point in the ecosystem service, yeah, Cheryl, I was reading the news about that today. Was it 100 tons of CO2 being emitted into the environment every single day from those cargo boats sitting? And actually, if there was another article in The Guardian yesterday where Greta Thunberg was basically ripping into most governments with their way of basic creative carbon accounting. So in the UK, we have they claim a clean biomass burner. And it is actually, it's the third highest polluter of CO2 in Europe. So it's about getting people understanding if you actually are, how do we open up the transparency so you know that these products, services that are actually being, offering actually something that is actually environmental, sustainable, instead of just having greenwashing, because that is the big problem. And, with COP26 coming up, and is a lot of it just going to be government, what's the phrase that Greta Thunberg, blah, blah, blah. Eco blah blah blah. And I actually, I'm sure a lot of you can raise your hands and say, yep, I want to be hopeful, but and I don't want to be political, but do I trust what's coming out of our government's mouth in the UK?
Well, the point is we are not here to figure out whether we should trust them or not. The question for us as a community is we believe in an agenda that says that there is value to nature-inspired innovation. There are useful implications for policymakers, the useful implications for investors, for academics, and for everybody else involved. I think we should focus on how do we get this message out to the appropriate people? How do we create a community that finds its own answers to these problems and self-organizes itself to push agendas with public policy experts or with others? And I think that's what we are here to do.
Yeah, and to see if there's any more questions coming up. To answer Margot's point about connecting into ESGs and work like that. Yeah, this is a conversation we're actually having with the Born Global Foundation, looking into ecosystem services and life cycle analysis. There's a number of basically funds in the UK that are actually very much pushing, you know, ESG and impact investment, but getting them to prove that actually where they, you know, are they actually doing the right thing instead of just saying the right thing.
And there's also a company called GIST. I think this was started by one of the presidents of World Wildlife Fund, and the whole idea was, how do we account for ecosystem services? How do we do that? And so that we can actually take each company and do actual accounting and say, these are the ecosystem services that the company utilizes. And if we do that, what does the books of that company look like? And they've been getting quite a bit of traction from fund managers who want to look at using something like this to evaluate different companies and different people in their portfolio. So yeah, and just as one example, I'm sure there are many other companies who are trying to look at, how do we do this? What's the way to measure? And I think we're still in the nascent stages because there's no one metric that people have agreed on. But I think there is progress, and you know, we should try.
Yeah, and there's a little private conversation going on here between Siddharth and Mark. If you don't know each other, I can introduce you. Yeah, we're looking, do we want to connect into the UKRI networks, or do we just see how we can get it run by ourselves and the academics without, and no offense to anyone from UKRI, seeing how it works without some sort of control that way, see how it works. So we've been looking into, our report is going to cover that a lot more detail. If anyone's looked at Lunch Club as a platform for connecting and various other ones, we want to build a network that's active. The more you put in, the more you get out. It's about what do you need and what can you offer, and about collecting people together. It's going back to the talk thing I was talking about with the Fraunhofer Institute. Do you need designers to actually create a viable product that's you know, is taking your widget or whatever that needs to then be put into something more you know, user-friendly and functional. It's interesting, the chat there, people sharing Indy Johar's basically one of his like 300 different NGOs he's got in the Dark Matters labs. They're doing something really interesting. And I was part of a workshop that they facilitated with Royal College of Art last year. So basically what we're going to do, as we're drawing it to a close, unless anyone's got any other question, I do apologize as more came in, is anyone interested, we will reach out, we will send you a copy of our slides when our report is fully finished. That basically are, yeah, we want your opinions. If you're based abroad, we can help connect into various things as well. And we just want to get stuff done, really, instead of just having people talking about stuff and getting stuff that gets to, you know, as Biofabricate called TRL4, the ugly prototype, because, you know, if those who work in industry, you know, that's not something you troll out. It's about, you know, we've got to start looking at how can we get these things very much pushed forward to solution space. Yeah, and look, we want your help. So if any of you have ideas on how do we address some of this, you have access to our email addresses, reach out and let's start having a conversation. We don't have all the answers, but if we work together, maybe we can hopefully develop an answer over time, or at least try different things and see what works and what doesn't. I do like Professor Lubo Yankovic question, you know, thing there about thinks physics is negotiable. Well, I suppose it's the whole thing is there's no such thing as biology, it's just chemistry and physics. That's the one to insult everybody.
And so math.
Yeah, it's all mathematics, yes. Well, exactly, yeah, it's about, yeah, their figures aren't stacking up, but I'm sure people just need to start, companies, startups, working with bigger companies actually aiming at looking at solving these things instead of waiting for governments to think it's useful. I mean,
and Matt was asking about social science, biomimicry applied in social science scope.
Honestly, there are a few efforts, and actually we have maybe few efforts that are we have cataloged, but I don't, from our survey at least, I don't think we found a lot of it. But I also know that in my biomimicry group, there are people in the US and in other countries where biomimicry has been used as a basis for looking at social systems and social organizations. But unfortunately, I don't have much knowledge on the subject. And our survey, when we did ask the questions, we didn't turn up too many of examples of social in our research, but whatever we have, we are happy to share. So please reach out to us offline and we will let you know what our data tells us. We'll be seeing Matt in Granada. Yeah. So yeah.
But we do find a few case studies relating.
Correct, but it's not as much as we found in other areas, right?
So but this is a key thing. We're looking at case studies, predominantly our case studies, and this is there's some great platforms out there, but we're looking at building up what solution focus and then building up as many of these case studies from the UK as possible. there's a great network in France called CBOS, and Kalina, if you're on the call, hello. And one of the key things that she's always going on about is promote what's in your country. I'm sure, to show that actually this is a great amount of, innovation coming out, because why turn up to France and talk about what's going on in Belgium or the US? Why not show this is here and now, and these people doing it, and then we can all turn around and actually start showcasing all our work to everywhere else.
Yeah, and just again, this presentation just touches the surface of it. I know in the comments box, people have been asking about case studies, other examples of startups. Yes, we do have all of those. And when we do have the report, you will find it'll include case studies in the UK. Primarily, since this report was in the UK, most of the case studies are likely to be in the UK with a few exceptions outside. But yes, there'll be case studies, there'll be examples, that'll include startups, that'll include pretty much all the topics we've covered here. Yes. So yes, thank you for asking. And we will be sharing that report once it's finalized, maybe in the next week or two, and it'll have that information. So yes, we do have that for the UK. And I'm sure one of the other ideas we had with this was, if we did this in the UK, hopefully we can inspire other people, whether it's in France with CBOS, or whether it's in Nordics or Germany or the US, so that if they do something like this in their own geographies, maybe when we put it all together, we have a much better understanding on a global level what's really happening, and maybe we can build a global network. But our aim was just to start something in the UK and hopefully learn from that and see what we could do here.
Yeah, and then connect into some of some people. Richard Dawson was sharing some stuff from the Biomimicry Global Network, where it's good. A lot of the people in there are very at the beginning, and that's great. But we can then have something that ties in with more senior researchers going into actually having companies about, focusing on delivering these solutions. That then we can use that and feed back into these global networks and Slack to actually start, showcasing what's actually out there and how it's happening. So.
Yeah, and Purvesh, look, these are things just like trying to push government policy changes, getting REBA or people like that, agents, those kinds of groups to be able to make changes to their policies, something similar. We don't really have an answer to how do you do that, but we're hoping that collectively there's an impetus to push for that and hopefully make it happen over the next few years. Yeah,
and we have collected, goodness, about far too much. 50,000 pieces of data points and everything from, and the idea is to, we're going to share on when you can get our report, you will get, you'll be able to download all the graphics. So we know how useful it is to share what's going on. And we plan to do this report, updating it every 2 years, because we feel a 2-year time span allows us to then build on actually some of the successes of the startups, and they'll go through certain parts of growth phase as well. Answering one of the questions about doing some work in the Fermion Business Institute work, we can do better than that. No, I think the way that they do it, we've started looking into patents and IP and publications and tying it into other things as well. But if anyone's not read these reports, I think they're all right. But when they start saying potential this and potential that every single page, is it just,
we can potentially do better if we collaborate with them as well. So maybe we talk to them and do that. But again, the idea is that we need to get everybody involved in solving the problem. More minds at it, it's probably going to be better in terms of coming up with a solution.
Definitely.
So thank you. And for those who were going to meet later in person, we will see you in 15 minutes in Spark York. If for those who are everywhere else, thank you again for joining. Elav, thank you very much for joining us on your holiday. Vacation.
Thank you, everyone. And
thank you,
you have our information. Please be in touch and let's see how we work together. Thank you.
Thank you.